Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, Massachusetts voters have their say, and we'll hear from a few of them as voting wraps up this Super Tuesday. Then Embrace Boston and the National Urban League are out with 2 reports detailing the harms of systemic racism for Black Americans. What do the city and the country need to do to close those gaps? And finally, a state task force is looking for new ways to fund the T as it runs out of money to fix itself. Will this mean more money from commuters' pockets? Millions of voters in Massachusetts and more than a dozen other states had their say in a series of Republican and Democratic caucuses and primaries. Here, polls will close in a little less than an hour. GBH News' Alexi Cohan was at the polls today, speaking with voters this morning. And she joins me now, along with Axios Boston reporter Mike Deehan. Thank you. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Crystal.
So, Alexi, what's the word? Like, what was the overall vibe for folks? Because I imagine it's a little bit drizzly outside, and people who run campaigns are always nervous about that.
Yes, the weather always plays a factor in people getting out of their homes to the polls and just also engaging with someone like me who's asking them questions. But it's really funny, something that I heard from a few people today when I asked them who they voted for and why, they were really kind of disappointed or disillusioned with the choices. They wish they had more choices. And then when I followed up and asked, well, how are you feeling about the November general? Do you feel enthusiastic? Do you feel excited? A lot of people said they were really enthusiastic and excited. So it's kind of interesting to see that kind of give and take where folks might be kind of disappointed with the options that they have, yet they're still really excited because it's an election, and at the end of the day, it's our civic duty, and you got to go out there and vote.
Absolutely. We have some sound here for with voters in Shrewsbury and in Somerville on their level of enthusiasm for the 2024 general election. Take a listen.
I want everybody to get out there, and whether you have to vote for Biden or against Trump, get out there and vote. I'm not enthusiastic at all because I don't like Trump and I don't like Biden. So I don't know if there's going to be a third party run or not. I may just have to hold my nose and vote. I am enthusiastic. More so because about what voting for Joe Biden would mean versus the alternatives. That would mean that we don't have a thief, a liar, and a criminal possibly being our president.
This primary feels a little bit like a holiday illusion, but I want to always exercise my right to vote and place a vote for a choice, someone different than the 2 old guys that I feel like we're inevitably going to end up at.
Now, Mike, I know that a lot of people, at least that's what I've been hearing, they hold their nose and vote, or that's what they expect to do.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing kind of throughout the country, and certainly here in Massachusetts. Just not a lot of enthusiasm for really what their choices are. Now, if you look at the Republican primary, Donald Trump still has a very solid grip on Republican voters in Massachusetts. This is also probably going to end up with a large chunk of those unenrolled voters, which of course make up well over 60% of voters in Massachusetts, who are going to pull the Republican primary ballot. So there is some enthusiasm on the strictly partisan side of things. When you look at the Democratic side, there is very strong support for President Biden, but again, lacking that enthusiasm to see him go forward and go again. I think what you just saw of some of those voters that you spoke with is that it's really just about holding their nose. If they're not huge on Biden, that usually means that they certainly don't want Trump back in office. And this is playing out all across the country. Massachusetts is no counterexample at all.
Nikki Haley came to Boston or greater Boston area trying to get some of those unenrolled voters. Do you think that is giving folks a little bit more choice this time around?
Yeah, having Haley still in that Republican primary race certainly would be, a refreshing change rather than just having one candidate on the ballot to choose from, the former president. But Haley isn't really going to fare too much better here in Massachusetts than she did in New Hampshire a few weeks ago. The electorate's kind of the same, especially on the right side of things. But if you're looking at where Haley's voters are coming from, who she was courting when she was in Massachusetts, it is that kind of old school, traditional Massachusetts Republican that we're seeing fewer and fewer of, either in elected office or active within the party.
Yeah, Alexi, I thought of the guy with the bike helmet and his choice of words about his choice at the ballot. I mean, do you find that it sort of runs the gamut depending on the type of voter that is going to the polls?
Yeah, it definitely runs the gamut. I mean, you saw that guy say that it was really important for him to accomplish this civic duty that we all have. And the gentleman, Preston, who said who's going to vote through his nose, he actually told me he voted for Haley. So I saw, a couple other Haley voters that mentioned that they were impressed with her leadership as ambassador and as governor, and that was kind of carrying them through on the vote. But regardless, that gentleman, again, Preston, said, well, hey, I know it's probably she's not going to be the nominee, but it still counts for me personally. I care to vote for her now.
What did you see when you were at the polls in terms of numbers? Because we know Secretary Galvin is expecting lower turnout than last year.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be lower turnout. Galvin has said he's expecting around 1 million voters in Massachusetts. That encompasses early voting, mail-in voting, and the folks who went out to the polls today. I went to Shrewsbury early this morning trying to catch that before work crowd of voters. It was a slow trickle kind of in and out. Yeah, it wasn't anything like I've seen in elections prior where there's sometimes a line around the block.
Yeah, Mike, do you think that's going to have a factor at how people are sort of being swayed, or the numbers we're going to see later on or even tomorrow?
I don't know if it will impact the final result.
Yeah.
I don't think that Nikki Haley is going to do any better against Donald Trump in a low turnout election than she would have if it was a higher turnout election. That ratio probably won't change that much. But it's absolutely true that it's raining a little bit in most of the state. Early voting, there were good, solid numbers on that, but the Secretary of State, like I said, is still expecting pretty low turnout numbers. That's 1 million in Massachusetts this time compared to, I believe it was 1.7 million in 2016, 1.6 in 2020. So we're kind of seeing the diminishment of that enthusiasm as these same candidates seem to pop up on these ballots over and over again.
Well, we'll have to see what happens. Break it all down here tomorrow. Alexi Cohan, Mike Deehan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Boston has a long legacy of racism and discrimination, and a new report digs into the lasting harms still facing the city's black residents. That includes massive discrepancies in wealth, housing, infrastructure, education, and criminal justice, all of which mirror the consequences of systemic racism felt across the United States. In a new report, the National Urban League explores how the state of Black America has and has not changed since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, finding, quote, 60 years later, the fight for equality is far from over. I'm joined now by Rahsaan Hall, President and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. I'm also joined by Imari Paris Jeffries, Executive Director of Embrace Boston. We're going to talk about their report as well. And Nicole Obi, President and CEO of the Black Economic Council, or BECMA, of Massachusetts. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks for having us.
We mentioned the National Urban League report, but Imari, I want to start with the Embrace Boston Harm Report. And I think that it confirms what a lot of folks in this space already know, but maybe a surprise to some people in that we have not come as far as we thought we might have.
Yeah, next year is the anniversary of the 1965 Freedom Rally, where Dr. King and 21,000 people marched from Roxbury to where the Embrace now stands. And so in 1965, those issues that they marched for were education, housing, racial equity, and poverty. And we see years and years later, the state of Black Boston, the state of BIPOC Boston hasn't changed much. And so I think if you ask any person in any major city in America what would be the issues, arguably those 4 things would be the issues, and I think we could add a few more.
And Nicole, I mean, business, the state of wealth, we talk about housing, infrastructure, things like that. I mean, it seems like the gap is persistent, and there is work being done, though, to change it or close it.
Absolutely. At BECMA, we're very focused on helping to build Black wealth, but we know that it's centered very much in addressing some of the issues that the harm report identifies, especially around things like housing in particular, and the long-standing implications that's had on our ability to build wealth.
Yeah. Rahsaan, we talked about the National Urban League report, 60 years, and we're still only have a score of 76%. Now, in my house, that wouldn't be a good grade.
Yeah, that's a little above passing, but and it's important to point out that this index has increased from 73% 2 years ago, but at this rate, Black people would not see parity with white people in this country for 180 years. And so although things have been moving forward in a good direction, we're so far from where they need to be.
Absolutely. You know, Imari, I want to go back to the harm report. Now, using data since 2013, we're talking about young people, and the percent of Black students in Massachusetts public schools, 8.7%. Okay, the percent of out-of-school suspensions issued to Black students in Massachusetts, 43%. And I think about if we're trying to change some of these generational issues, we're talking about young people. It doesn't seem like we're setting them up for success in our public school system.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that we attempted to do with the harm report is to talk about how these issues are generational, how the impacts of state-sanctioned racism, how the impacts of slavery has harmed communities of color, Black people in particular, generation after generation. And so what was not fixed in the past is not working in the present. What won't work in the present will definitely not work in the future. The harm report outlines 7 of the 8 injury areas: culture, symbols, transportation, housing, education, wealth, health, and climate. And these are the areas that state-sanctioned racism has harmed people of color, and I think they're interrelated. And so I think that was one of the things that we were hoping to set out to really show and demonstrate how these things need to be fixed in order for us to have an inclusive, thriving city.
Absolutely. And Nicole, you know, the Globe actually interviewed one of the owners of the Nubian Square Markets that's there. And as a business person, he was like, I need change. I came to this community to make change, but I need help on a federal and on a state level.
Yeah, absolutely. Nubian Markets is one of our BECMA members, and so we're really excited about having them in our community and doing the work that they do, bringing fresh food to the community. That's still very rare. And so we want to continue to make sure that we're supporting them and others that are trying to do things to move us in a much more healthy direction, but it's not that easy.
Absolutely. Excuse me, Rahsaan, we have a full screen graphic of the National Urban League's Equality Index. And as we talk about, you know, our young people, folks right now, first calculated in 2005, we talked about this earlier, it aims to show how well Black Americans are doing in comparison to white. So you mentioned the difference between last year and this year, 3%. Roughly. Since 2005, we only have 72.9%. And I was reading how when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the subsequent package of legislation happened, it was able to cut poverty drastically and much faster within 15 years. Whereas now it seems like we're changing drip by drips and drabs here.
Yeah, and that's why legislation is important. That's why federal tax cuts like the child credit is important. That's why making investments for infrastructure and being intentional about directing funds towards communities of color and Black communities in particular to cover the gap are so important. And you look, and the State of Black America report covers these 5 indices: economics, health, education, social justice, and civic engagement. And when we are not doing well in any of these areas, we're not doing well overall. If you can't get up out of bed in the morning and go to work because you're sick, and that may be informed by where you live or the environmental contaminants that you are exposed to or the stress of racism, those are the things that are going to impact the overall wellness and well-being of an entire community.
One thing we've been focused on here at GBH is the conversation around reparations. And in the harm report, Imari, is the need for reparations and a, quote, third reconstruction. So what does that mean? And tell me how we'd use the $14.2 trillion that's recommended by the report to get to that place.
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question, right? And
or the $1 trillion
the $1 trillion question. And I think this idea of the third reconstruction stems back to this opportunity, this time where there was an emergence of Black elected and civic leaders, followed by legislation, followed by growth, followed by this retraction. And so we saw that first reconstruction happen immediately after the Civil War. Again, civic, elected, emergence, retraction. We saw another second reconstruction happen after the civil rights movement. And some argue after the death of George Floyd, we were in the midst of a third reconstruction. And what we're seeing in the political climate across the country is a part of this retraction stage. This deterioration of DEI, the deterioration of affirmative action, this retraction of equal protections under law for many marginalized communities. So this is the reconstruction that we're talking about, and the reason we keep calling it a reconstruction because the construction was never finished. And so I think this opportunity with this $1 trillion is a part of that reconstruction. I think the redress is a part of that reconstruction. And when we think about reparations, we tend to draw on William Doherty's concept of ARC. Acknowledgement, redress, and closure. And so this opportunity to acknowledge past wrongs is one of the things that we set out to do with the harm report. You have to acknowledge the things that are wrong before you can go to fixing things. And I think we have a habit as a society to go to fixing things so that we can avoid the conversation. And so we're hoping that this is an opportunity where the conversation can actually occur.
And Rahsaan, the National Urban League report has also called for something similar in terms of an acknowledgement of past wrongs, but also more tangible steps toward closing the gap here in terms of equality with Black Americans and their white counterparts.
Yes, and part of the reason I'm not able to join you all in studio today is because I'm in D.C. right now at the National Urban League's Legislative Policy Conference with the release of the State of Black America report. And the report is special because it does three things. One, it looks at our progress since the 1964 Voting Rights Act. It also gives the Equality Index, but then it also does a progress report on the Biden administration. And so to your point around the intentional efforts to make investments in closing that gap, it looks at some of the progress and promises fulfilled by the Biden administration, but also some of the steps yet to be fulfilled, like eliminating college debt, making sure that voting rights are secure, making sure that there is criminal justice reform. And this is something that's happening at every level of the Urban League, including the local affiliates like the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts.
There's a lot of work being done right here in Greater Boston, and I'm sure we'll have all of you back on the show very soon. Imari Paris Jeffries, Nicole Obi, and Rahsaan Hall, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And finally tonight, Governor Healey's new transportation funding task force met for the first time a few days back, tasked with making recommendations for sustainable funding for the MBTA and other transportation projects. The biggest question at hand, how can we fund the T and its near constant need for fixes in the short term and heck, the long term? To answer that question and more, I'm joined by GBH News' transportation reporter, Bob C. Bob, thanks for being with us.
Sure, good to be here.
Yeah, so the big question is 31 members. Are we going to actually get something done?
Well, that's a very good question. You have that many people on a task force. Yeah. But it's made to represent the broadest cross-section of people in the Commonwealth, both geographically, economically, socially, with a lot of business representation, a lot of elected officials. So everybody's going to have a say in what this task force finally comes up with.
Well, speaking of having a say, we did talk to some folks, some writers of the MBTA, about how they think the MBTA should actually be funded. So let's take a listen.
I think the funding for the MBTA should come from a cross-section of different tax revenues throughout the Commonwealth.
Maybe increasing gas prices would help because it would get less cars on the road. I definitely don't think they should increase MBTA prices because this is what's accessible for most people.
I think that there needs to be some higher donor functions or something happening, maybe like a fundraiser for the city, something where more money can come in beyond taxes, because clearly we need more than that.
Yeah, so let's talk about what is their number one thing on the agenda there?
I think it's to develop a long-term sustainable funding source. That's the number one challenge, because we sort of go from crisis to crisis financially. And what was set up using the state sales tax, for instance, many years ago has not been adequate. And so they've always had to come up with some kind of way to plug those budget gaps. So that's the main goal. Let's get something that we can depend on and plan on in the years ahead.
So speaking of, we were talking a little bit about like the way that the T or transportation, subway transportation is thought of. And you actually spoke with the head of the New York Metropolitan Transit Authority, someone we know or may know. And, you know, they think about the subway, their version of the T, very differently. That's right. Rich Davey, who's now heading up the MTA in New York, used to run the MBTA. And he was Secretary of Transportation here for a while, so he knows Boston very well. But as he put it in New York, the subway is like air and water. People just cannot live without it. And I'm not sure, even though the T is essential for what we do here in Boston, people perceive it the same way. And I think that has a lot to do with how willing people are to spend the money to keep it going. And that's in New York. And I understand he's able to avoid a deficit over a vast transit system that, well, we were counting 3 states at least. That's right. It's the largest system in the United States. In fact, if you took the next 7 largest transportation systems, they would not equal the New York system. They serve more than 7 million passengers a day. They have 47,000 employees. Budget of $20+ billion every year. So it's a very big operation. And so the financial situation is not the same as it is here in Boston. They have a tremendous amount of business support in New York City. And why I wanted to talk with Mr. Davey was they're the only transit system in the country coming out of the pandemic that actually has a balanced budget, not for just next year, but for the next 4 or 5 years. And I asked him, how did he do it? Well, how did he? Well, first of all, this business tax on all the employers in the city, the employers agreed to raise it from like 3.4 to 6%. I mean, a substantial amount of money. And that's going to produce more than $1 billion a year right there. Then there are 3 new casinos that are going to be built in New York City. And the transit system will be getting all of those revenues. And then they also have a paratransit situation there, which they share the cost with the state, but they've been willing to take on more of the cost, the transit authority, and they're getting more money from the state for that. So I think those are the general big, items that they're counting on. They also are raising fares. They already raised fares once. They're going to be raising them twice in 2025 and 2027, about 4%. And they have a huge transit system that they can toll. Unlike here in Boston, we're very limited, to the Mass Pike and Tobin Bridge and so forth and so on. In New York, they have all kinds of bridges and tunnels that they can toll. And so that revenue will be adding to the pot as well. Well, we heard from folks, they don't want to pay any more taxes and they don't want to pay anything more in the tolls, but somehow the T needs to get to a point of good repair, which we are not at. That's right. We're estimated $24.5 billion to get to that state of good repair. So the money does have to come from somewhere. And I think Governor Haley was smart, in a sense, not to take this on all by herself, but to have a whole group of people contemplate everything on the table. What do we have? From everything from tolls, fares, taxes, fees, congestion pricing, which is very controversial. Let's put it all on the table and see what we can come to agreement about. So, or is there any indication that because there's so many folks on this board from different places, different sectors, that perhaps maybe the perception will change about the necessity of the T and the need to fund it? Well, I think people have come to realize, especially since the pandemic, how essential this transit system is. When we had the Orange Line shutdown a couple of years ago,
people realized, wow, you shut down one of those subway lines, it really has a tremendous effect on people. And there's more of a realization that the people who depend on public transit are often people who have no other choice. They don't own cars. They're often lower income working people who really depend on it, and there's a certain obligation to make sure that they can get where they're going. And this is in terms of buses as well as the MBTA. So there's a lot of movement to improve the service on all levels. It's taking time. People are going to have to be patient. But at the end, there will be some kind of cost that we somehow are going to have to figure out how to bear.
Well, let's talk about buses, this redesign of Blue Hill Avenue.
Yeah.
You said 15 years in the making.
That's right. 15 years ago, at least, it was first, proposed that Blue Hill Avenue, which is a fairly wide avenue, be reconfigured in some way to make it more attractive, more useful, easier to drive through, easier for buses primarily. So 15 years later, we finally have a plan and a commitment from Mayor Wu for $44 million to reconfigure Blue Hill Avenue. And the biggest change would be a center-running bus lane, so that the bus lanes would not have to be on the perimeter of the streets, taking away parking and interfering with that, which is always a big issue. But it would be running down the center. Now, this already happens on Columbus Ave. And even though there was some concern and opposition when it first went into effect, people have learned to live with it. And they realized that making the buses more efficient is really the most important goal. If you get on a bus and it's sitting there in traffic, it's not doing you or anyone else much good. But if you're getting on a bus that operates kind of like a subway, so that it can easily move up and down the thoroughfare, that's a huge difference. So I think eventually there's going to be community opposition. I know there's going to be a lot of community meetings to get people to buy into this, because it's going to be a major change. But it's something that will make that avenue much more useful for people traveling and also living there as well, I think.
Yeah, lots going on, and of course we'll have you back to talk all about it. Bob C., thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight, but come right back here tomorrow. We'll dig into Super Tuesday results and what they mean for the general election. Plus, as sea levels rise, is the Earth getting wider? The host of GBH's Curiosity Desk, Edgar B. Howick III, will answer those questions and more. That's all tomorrow at 7. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Crystal Haynes. Good night.
Once the high